This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity Podcast, the Becker Business Minute Podcast. The discussion today is around the independent study, the often falseness of the independent study. And here's what I mean by this. There are millions of studies done for a million different reasons. And one of the things that happens is sometimes people that aren't skeptics will get caught believing that the independent study is truly independent. I'll give you an example. You could see an independent study that says that CRNAs aren't as good as doctors in 13 different ways. And this may or may not be true, depending on what you're looking at. But what really happens is, to really understand whether the study is legit or not, you have to understand who is funding the study. Is the study being funded by an association of physicians that are trying to keep things in physicians' territory versus CRNA territories? And that's just one example. The second type of study you might think about is the valuation, the quote-unquote independent valuation. And this is not to take shots at the valuation industry, but if you're looking at buying into a company and they've put together a valuation that quote-unquote is independent, you do have to understand who has funded that study. Has that been funded by the seller? Has it been funded by the investment bank? Who's funding that study? And then you have to do your own diligence as to how legitimate that study sounds and how legitimate the results of that study are. So one of the things we constantly see, and we see this throughout business, throughout industry, throughout politics, is what we call the falseness of the independent study. And it's not that many studies aren't independent, many studies aren't unbiased, but a lot of them are. And one of the tricks as a researcher, a reader, an advocate, an investor, whatever you're doing, is to try and understand, is it an independent study? Is the independent valuation? Is whatever it is, the independent thing that you're looking at, truly independent, or is that just a mirage because they're really advocating for a position of one side or the other? This came up recently in a study that we were watching, that somebody was observing on or commenting on, and it turns out the study was really funded by one advocate group, and thus it had one outcome, and it may or may not be the right outcome, but certainly you have to call into question because it was done by a biased sort of study, a biased source. Thank you for listening to the Becker Private Equity Podcast, the Becker Business Minute Podcast. And again, this is not to slam all independent studies, all independent valuations, but it is as a reader to make sure you're conscious of who's authoring the study, who's paying for it, and so forth and so on. Thank you for listening to the Becker Private Equity Podcast.